Do you need a friend? A little girl asked the woman at the cafe, and then her reaction changed everything. Before we continue, please tell us, where in the world are you tuning in from? We love seeing how far our stories travel. Vanessa Brooks sat in the back corner of Rosewood Coffee on a drizzly Saturday afternoon in Portland, staring at her laptop screen, pretending to work on translating a German technical manual about industrial ventilation systems. And honestly, she'd read the same paragraph 4 times without absorbing a single word because her brain was too busy screaming about how pathetic it was to spend another weekend completely alone in a coffee shop, surrounded by people who all seemed to have someone. She'd moved to Portland 8 months ago for what she'd called a fresh start, but what was really just running away from a relationship that had slowly suffocated her back in Minneapolis. And she'd had this whole vision of reinventing herself in a new city, making friends, joining book clubs or hiking groups, or literally any social activity that would prove she was a functioning adult capable of human connection. Instead, she'd somehow managed to become more isolated than she'd ever been in her life. And the irony wasn't lost on her that working as a freelance translator meant she spent all day dealing with words in 3 different languages, but barely spoke to another human being face to face for weeks at a time. Her entire social interaction consisted of ordering her usual vanilla latte from the barista, who was friendly but clearly didn't remember her name, despite the fact that Vanessa had been coming here 5 days a week for 6 months, and maybe texting her mom back in Minnesota, who kept asking if she'd made any friends yet, in a tone that suggested she already knew the answer. The worst part wasn't even the loneliness itself, it was the fact that Vanessa had somehow gotten so deep into her own head about it that the idea of actually approaching someone and trying to make a friend felt impossible. Like there was this invisible wall between her and the rest of the world that she'd built brick by brick without meaning to. She had her headphones on playing music she wasn't really listening to, and her laptop angled in a way that screamed, "I'm busy, don't talk to me," even though she desperately wanted someone to talk to her, and this was her life now, performing the act of being a person who had things to do and places to be, when really she just came here because going back to her tiny studio apartment to sit alone felt even more depressing. What Vanessa didn't know was that someone had been noticing her for the past month, and that someone was a 6-year-old girl named Emma, who had the kind of radar for sadness that only kids seem to have before the world teaches them to mind their own business. Emma Ruiz came to Rosewood Coffee every Saturday with her dad Hector, and it was their special thing, their routine that marked his one guaranteed day off from running his small plumbing business. Hector was 33 and had been raising Emma solo since her mom walked out when Emma was barely a year old, and he'd done it with the help of his mom Rosa, who watched Emma during the week while he worked. But Saturdays were his and Emma's time together. They'd get hot chocolate for Emma and black coffee for Hector, and they'd sit at one of the small tables by the window and Emma would tell him about her week at school while he actually listened instead of being distracted by his phone or thinking about the next job. And these couple of hours were the best part of his week. Emma had noticed the sad lady in the corner during their second visit to the cafe, and she'd asked her dad in that loud whisper, "Kids do, that's basically just talking at normal volume. Daddy, why is that lady always by herself?" Hector had glanced over at Vanessa, who had her headphones on and was typing something, and he'd told Emma that some people like being alone, that it was okay to enjoy your own company. But Emma wasn't convinced because she'd been watching the lady for weeks now, and every single time they came in, she was sitting in the same spot, always alone, and she never looked happy even when she smiled at the person who brought her coffee. "I don't think she likes it," Emma had said during their third Saturday. "She looks lonely, Daddy, like how I feel when you have to work late and I'm waiting with Abuela." Hector had tried to explain that you can't just walk up to strangers and ask them if they're lonely because adults have different rules about that kind of thing. But Emma had this look on her face that Hector recognized, the same stubborn determination she got when she decided something was unfair and needed fixing. The fourth Saturday in October, Emma had apparently reached her limit. In the second Hector got up to use the bathroom, she saw her opportunity and took it. Vanessa was deep in her pretend work spiral, headphones on, when she felt a tap on her table, and when she looked up, there was a little girl with dark curly hair in 2 puff balls on either side of her head, standing there looking at her with the kind of serious expression that seemed way too old for someone who probably still believed in the tooth fairy. Vanessa pulled off her headphones and said, "Hey, sweetie, are you lost?" Because that seemed like the logical reason a random kid would be at her table. But Emma shook her head and said with zero hesitation, "Do you need a friend? Because you're always alone here, and you look really sad." Vanessa's brain completely short-circuited for a second, because out of all the things she'd expected this child to say, that wasn't even in the top 100, and she opened her mouth to give some polite adult response about how she was fine and just working. But what came out instead was a sound that was half laugh and half sob. The tears started before she could stop them, just completely ambushed her, and suddenly she was crying in the middle of a coffee shop while a 6-year-old stared at her with growing concern. "Yes," Vanessa managed to choke out through tears she was trying desperately to wipe away with her sleeve. "I really, really do need a friend, and nobody's asked me that in so long I forgot people even could." Emma's eyes went wide and she patted Vanessa's hand in that gentle way kids do when they're trying to comfort someone but aren't totally sure how. And she said, "It's okay, you can be my friend. I'm really good at being friends." Vanessa was trying to pull herself together and failing spectacularly when she heard a man's voice say, "Emma, oh my God, did you make this woman cry?" And she looked up to see a guy in his 30s wearing a flannel shirt and work boots looking absolutely mortified. Hector had come back from the bathroom to find his daughter at a stranger's table, and that stranger actively sobbing. And his first instinct was to grab Emma and apologize and get out of there, before this got even more awkward. "I'm so sorry," he said to Vanessa while gently pulling Emma back. "She's been watching you for weeks, and I should have known she was planning something. Whatever she said, I'm really sorry." Vanessa shook her head and tried to form words. "No, it's not. She didn't. I'm the one who should apologize. Your daughter asked me a simple question, and I just completely lost it. I'm so sorry." Emma looked between the two adults who were both apologizing to each other and said with perfect kid logic, "Nobody needs to be sorry. I asked if she needed a friend, and she said yes. So now we're friends. That's how it works." Hector looked at his daughter and then at Vanessa, who was still wiping tears off her face, and he made a decision that would change all three of their lives, even though he didn't know it yet. "Do you want to sit with us?" he asked Vanessa, gesturing to the table by the window where his coffee was getting cold. "You don't have to, but if my daughter just made you cry, the least I can do is offer you a place to sit where you're not alone." Vanessa should have said no because sitting with strangers wasn't something she did. Her social anxiety usually kicked in hard at moments like this. But something about the genuine kindness in this man's offer and the way his daughter was still holding her hand made her say, "Yeah, I'd really like that actually." They ended up sitting together for over an hour, and Vanessa learned that the man's name was Hector, and he ran a small plumbing business, and Emma was in first grade and obsessed with learning about space. And Emma learned that Vanessa translated documents for a living, which Emma thought was the coolest job in the world, because, "You know 3 languages and I only know 1.5 because I'm learning Spanish from abuela." Hector told her about their Saturday cafe tradition, and Vanessa admitted she came here almost every day because working from home meant she could go days without talking to another person, and it was starting to make her feel like she was going slightly crazy. "I moved here 8 months ago, and I still don't have a single friend in this city," Vanessa said, and then immediately felt embarrassed for admitting that out loud. But Emma just nodded like this made perfect sense and said, "Well, now you have me. And my dad, if you want, he's pretty nice for a grown-up." When they finally packed up to leave because Emma had a birthday party to get to, Hector pulled out his phone and said, "Emma's going to ask me every single day if you're okay, so if you want, we could exchange numbers, and then she can check on you directly. No pressure, though." Vanessa felt something warm spread through her chest that she barely recognized as hope, and she put her number in his phone and said, "I'd really like that. Tell Emma thank you for asking the question nobody else thought to ask." Hector smiled. "She's got this thing where she sees people who are hurting and she just can't help herself. I'm raising either a future therapist or a professional meddler. We'll see which way it goes." Vanessa watched them leave, Emma turning around to wave 3 separate times before they disappeared around the corner. And she sat back down at her table and stared at her laptop and realized she was smiling for the first time in weeks. Her phone buzzed 10 minutes later with a text from an unknown number that said, "Hi, it's Emma. My dad is typing this because I'm 6. Are you still sad? Do you want to come to the cafe next Saturday? We will be there at 2. And Vanessa typed back, Hi, Emma. I'm still a little sad, but talking to you helped a lot. I'll see you Saturday at 2. And for the first time since moving to Portland, she felt like maybe she wasn't completely alone anymore. Saturday coffee at Rosewood turned into a weekly thing that Nessa started planning her entire week around, and Emma's daily texts became the highlight of her mornings. Little messages like, My teacher said I'm a good reader today, or Dad burned breakfast again, lol, that made Nessa feel like she was part of something, instead of just observing life from the outside. 3 weeks into their friendship, Emma announced at the cafe that she'd told her entire first grade class about how she made a friend for a lonely person, and her teacher, Miss Roberts, said that was very kind and gave her a kindness award, which Emma showed to Nessa with enormous pride. Hector looked slightly embarrassed when Emma shared this, but Nessa just laughed and said, I hope you told them your new friend is very grateful. And Emma nodded seriously and said, I told them you don't cry anymore when I ask questions. By November, the friendship had evolved into something that went beyond Saturday mornings, and Hector started texting Nessa during the week about things that had nothing to do with Emma, like a funny thing that happened on a job site or asking her opinion on what kind of birthday cake Emma would want. Nessa found herself looking forward to his messages almost as much as Emma's, and she'd catch herself smiling at her phone while working on translations and have to remind herself this was just friendship, that Hector was being nice because his daughter had adopted her. When her apartment radiator started making a horrible clanking noise that kept her up all night, she mentioned it casually during one of their Saturday meetups, and Hector showed up at her place that Tuesday evening with his toolbox saying, I can't have Emma's friend freezing to death. She'd never forgive me. He fixed the radiator in about 20 minutes while Nessa made awkward conversation from the doorway because having him in her space felt different than the neutral territory of the cafe, and when he was done, he refused to let her pay him. Friends don't charge friends, he said while packing up his tools. And Nessa said, Well then, friends should at least feed friends. I make really good pasta if you and Emma want to come over for dinner this weekend. That's how she ended up hosting her first dinner party in her Portland apartment, and Emma brought drawings to decorate the walls, and Hector brought wine, and somehow Nessa's tiny kitchen felt full in a way it never had before. A few weeks later, Hector invited Nessa to Emma's school fall festival, and she helped Emma win a goldfish at the ring toss and ate terrible carnival food and met some of the other parents who all seemed to assume she was Hector's girlfriend, until he corrected them, saying, No, she's Emma's friend. We all just hang out. Nessa told herself the weird disappointment she felt at that clarification was ridiculous because they were just friends. But Emma grabbed her hand during the 3-legged race and said, You should be on Dad's team because you're taller than me. And standing that close to Hector with their legs tied together made Nessa's heart do things that definitely weren't just friendly. Everything shifted the week before Thanksgiving when Hector's mom Rosa invited Nessa to family dinner, and she showed up nervous to meet more people. But Rosa hugged her like they'd known each other for years and said, Emma talks about you constantly. You're all I hear about. The dinner was loud and warm and everything Nessa's own small family gatherings had never been. And Rosa kept piling food on her plate and asking about her work and her life. And at one point she pulled Nessa aside in the kitchen and said, My son smiles more since you've been around. I don't know what you're doing, but keep doing it. Nessa felt her face get hot because she hadn't been doing anything except being herself. But Rosa just patted her hand and said, Sometimes that's exactly what people need. The week after Thanksgiving, Hector showed up at the cafe looking stressed about paperwork for his plumbing business. Something about permits and licenses that had to be renewed. And Nessa looked at the forms and realized she could actually help because dealing with bureaucracy in multiple languages was basically her entire job. She spent 3 hours that afternoon walking him through the process and filling out forms while Emma colored next to them. And when they were done, Hector said, I owe you big time. I've been putting this off for months because I didn't understand half of it. Nessa just shrugged. You fixed my radiator. I helped with paperwork. That's what friends do, right? But the way he smiled at her made her stomach flip. Driving home that night, Nessa had to admit to herself that this had stopped being just friendship somewhere along the way, that she looked forward to Hector's texts more than she should, that she found excuses to see him outside their Saturday routine, that Emma's hugs felt like coming home. But she also knew Hector had never indicated he felt the same way. He was always careful to maintain boundaries, always made sure Emma was present when they hung out, always introduced her as Emma's friend, not his. She told herself she was okay with that having them in her life at all was more than she'd had 8 months ago. But late at night, she wondered what it would be like if he looked at her the way she started looking at him. Everything got complicated in early December when Nessa's ex-boyfriend Jason showed up at Rosewood on a Wednesday afternoon, and she looked up from her laptop to see him standing at her table like he'd been summoned from her worst memories. "Hey, Ness, I've been trying to reach you," he said, and his voice had that familiar tone that used to make her feel small, and Nessa felt her whole body tense up. Jason explained he'd moved to Portland 2 months ago, that he'd been thinking about her, that he wanted to talk about giving their relationship another shot, and Nessa sat there completely frozen because this was the last thing she'd expected. He asked if they could get dinner to talk properly, and Nessa heard herself say, "I need to think about it," instead of the immediate no she should have said. And Jason left his new number and walked out like he hadn't just thrown a grenade into her carefully rebuilt life. She didn't tell Hector about Jason showing up, didn't mention it during their Saturday coffee or in their evening texts, and she could tell he noticed something was off because he asked twice if she was okay, and she just said she was busy with work. The truth was she didn't know what to say, didn't know how to explain that her past had shown up asking for another chance, and part of her was actually considering it, because at least Jason was familiar. At least with him she knew what to expect, even if what she expected was disappointment. Emma noticed too and asked, "Is Miss Nessa sad again?" And Hector had to tell his daughter that sometimes adults had complicated feelings that were hard to explain. Nessa met Jason for coffee the following Tuesday, and he apologized for how their relationship ended. Said he'd done a lot of work on himself, that moving to Portland was partly to start fresh and partly because he couldn't stop thinking about her. She listened to him talk and realized she didn't feel anything, no anger or longing or even real interest. But she also didn't shut him down immediately because some part of her was scared that if she said no to this, she was betting everything on something with Hector that might not even exist. Jason asked if he could take her to dinner that weekend, and she said maybe. And when she got home, she stared at her phone trying to decide if she should text Hector and wondering why she felt like she was doing something wrong when they weren't even together. By the end of that week, Nessa had stopped responding to Hector's texts as quickly, stopped suggesting they hang out beyond Saturdays, and she could feel herself pulling away without fully understanding why. Hector noticed immediately and assumed she was moving on, that maybe she'd made other friends or started dating someone, and the thought of it made his chest tight in a way that confirmed what he'd been trying to ignore for months. He talked to his mom about it, and Rosa said, "If you have feelings for her, you need to tell her before someone else does." But Hector shook his head. "She came into our lives because she needed friends. I'm not going to pressure her into something she doesn't want, and I have to think about Emma. I can't let her get attached to someone who might not stick around." The Saturday before Christmas, Nessa showed up at the cafe, and Hector was polite but distant in a way he'd never been before. And Emma kept looking between them like she knew something was wrong but didn't understand what. When Emma went to the bathroom, Nessa tried to bridge the gap. "Is everything okay? You seem different." And Hector just gave her this sad smile and said, "Yeah, everything's fine. I'm glad you're doing well." The conversation felt forced and awkward, and nothing like the easy comfort they'd built over months. And when Nessa left, she felt worse than she had before Emma had asked her that question all those weeks ago. That night, Emma asked her dad why Miss Nessa seemed sad again, and Hector tried to explain in terms a 6-year-old would understand. "Sometimes people need us for a while, and then they're okay, and they don't need us as much anymore. And that's good because it means we help them." Emma thought about this and said, "But Daddy, I don't think she's okay. I think she's sad in a different way now." And Hector felt his heart break a little because his kid was probably right, but he didn't know what to do about it. Emma crawled into his lap and said, "Did we mess up? Did we not help her enough?" And Hector hugged his daughter close. "No bug, you did everything right. Sometimes grown-up stuff is just complicated." Nessa sat alone at Rosewood Coffee on a rainy Wednesday afternoon, 3 days before Christmas with her laptop closed for once, and she'd come to the same table where Emma had asked her that life-changing question 2 months ago because she needed to think clearly, and this was the only place that felt like it made sense anymore. Jason had texted her that morning asking if she'd made a decision about trying again, and she'd stared at that message for 20 minutes before she finally understood what had been gnawing at her for the past 2 weeks. She wasn't confused about Jason. She'd known the second he showed up that she didn't want him back. What she was actually scared of was admitting what she did want, because wanting something real with Hector and Emma meant risking the kind of hurt she'd spent 8 months trying to avoid. She pulled out her phone and typed a message to Jason that she should have sent 2 weeks ago. "I appreciate you reaching out, but I'm not interested in trying again. I've moved on, and I hope you can too." And the second she hit send, she felt like she could actually breathe for the first time in days. But sending that text didn't fix the mess she'd made with Hector. Didn't explain why she'd pulled away or why she'd let him think she didn't need him anymore, when the truth was she needed him so much it terrified her. Nessa sat there watching the rain and realized she'd been so focused on not being lonely that she'd missed the part where she'd actually fallen in love. And now she had to figure out if she'd already ruined it by being too scared to be honest. She found Hector's plumbing shop on East Burnside 20 minutes later, a small garage space with Ruiz Plumbing and Repair painted on the window. And her hands were shaking when she parked her car, because this was either going to be the bravest thing she'd ever done or the most humiliating. Hector was at the workbench organizing tools when she walked in, and when he looked up and saw her, his expression went from surprise to guarded so fast it made her heart hurt. "Nessa, what are you doing here? Is everything okay?" he asked, and his voice was polite in that careful way people use when they're protecting themselves. And she realized with a sinking feeling that she'd hurt him more than she thought. "I need to talk to you about something, and I should have done it 2 weeks ago, but I was being a coward," Nessa said, and the words came out in a rush. And Hector set down the wrench he was holding and leaned against the workbench waiting. She took a breath and just said it. "My ex-boyfriend showed up in Portland. He moved here and wanted to try again. And I didn't tell you because I didn't know how, and I got scared and pulled away. And I'm so sorry." Hector's jaw tightened and he looked at the floor. "You don't owe me an explanation about who you date, Nessa. We're friends. You can do whatever you want." But the way he said friends felt like he was using it as a shield, and she couldn't blame him. "I know I don't owe you an explanation," Nessa said, and her voice was shaking now. "But I want to give you one anyway, because you deserve to know the truth. I'm not getting back together with him. I told him no this morning, and the reason I got so weird about it wasn't because I was confused about him. It was because I was terrified about you." Hector looked up at that, and his expression shifted to something between confused and hopeful. "Terrified about me? What does that mean?" Nessa felt tears starting, but she didn't try to stop them. "It means I realized I'm not lonely anymore, and it's not because I made a bunch of friends or started dating my ex again. It's because a 6-year-old asked me if I needed a friend and actually meant it, and her dad let me become part of your lives, and somewhere along the way I fell in love with both of you, and that scared me more than being alone ever did." The silence that followed felt like it lasted forever, and Hector just stared at her with an expression she couldn't read. And Nessa was starting to think she completely misread everything when he finally spoke. "I pulled back because I thought you were outgrowing us." His voice was rough. "I thought you were making other friends and getting your life together and didn't need me and Emma hanging around anymore. And I had to protect her because she's already so attached to you. I couldn't let her get hurt when you moved on." Nessa's heart broke at that. "Hector, I'm not moving on. I don't want to move on. You and Emma are the best part of my life, and I was an idiot for not telling you that sooner." Hector pushed off the workbench and took a step closer. "I need you to be really clear with me right now, because I can't do halfway, not with Emma involved. Are you saying you have feelings for me?" Nessa nodded, and the tears were falling freely now. "Yes, real feelings. The kind that make me check my phone every 5 minutes hoping you texted. The kind that make Saturday mornings the highlight of my week. I'm completely gone for you, and I'm sorry it took me this long to say it." Hector's expression finally softened and he reached for her hand. I've had feelings for you since about week 3, when you made Emma laugh so hard she snorted hot chocolate out of her nose. But I didn't want to mess up what we had. And then when you pulled away, I thought I'd imagined the whole thing. They stood there in his shop holding hands while the rain pounded on the roof, and Nessa said, "So what do we do now?" And Hector pulled her closer. "Now we try this for real, but we do it slow because Emma's already attached, and I need to know you're really in this before we change what it looks like to her. Can you do slow?" Nessa nodded against his chest. "I can do slow. I'm not going anywhere, Hector. I promise." He kissed the top of her head and said, "Good, because Emma's been asking every day when you're coming back, and I'm running out of ways to distract her." 3 months later, Nessa and Hector had figured out what slow looked like, and it looked like official date nights when Emma was with Rosa, and family dinners at his place where Nessa taught Emma how to make cookies, and holding hands at the Saturday cafe meetings that had become sacred for all 3 of them. Emma had asked approximately 50 times if Nessa was her dad's girlfriend now, and Hector had finally said yes, which made Emma announce to her entire first-grade class that her friend Miss Nessa was now also her dad's special person. Rosa had pulled Nessa aside at Sunday dinner and said, "I knew from the beginning you two were going to figure it out. Took you long enough." And Nessa had just laughed because she was pretty sure everyone had known except her and Hector. On a Saturday morning in late March, they were back at Rosewood Coffee in their usual spot. Emma working on a drawing while Hector read the paper, and Nessa worked on a translation, and it felt like the most natural thing in the world. Nessa looked up and noticed a woman sitting alone in the corner table where she used to sit. Laptop open and headphones on with that same invisible look Nessa remembered wearing like armor, and she nudged Emma and pointed discreetly. Emma followed her gaze and her eyes got wide with recognition. "Dad, that lady looks like Miss Nessa used to look, like she's sad and alone." And Hector looked over, then back at his daughter with a small smile. "What do you think you should do about that bug?" Emma didn't hesitate. She slid out of her chair and walked across the cafe with Nessa following a few steps behind. And when Emma reached the woman's table, she waited patiently until the woman noticed her and took off her headphones. "Hi, I'm Emma, and I'm 7 1/4, and I have a question for you," Emma said in her clear voice. And the woman looked confused but said, "Okay, what's your question?" Emma smiled. "Do you need a friend? Because you're sitting alone and you look sad." And I asked that same question to her, she pointed at Nessa, and it changed everything. The woman's eyes filled with tears, and she looked at Nessa, who sat down in the empty chair. "She asked me that exact question 5 months ago in this same cafe. I was new to Portland and completely isolated, and I broke down crying right here at this table. And she didn't think I was weird, she just decided to be my friend. And then her dad became my friend, and now I'm not lonely anymore." The woman wiped her eyes. "I just moved here 2 months ago, and I don't know anyone. I come here every day and just sit by myself, hoping someone will talk to me, but too scared to talk to them first." Nessa smiled and gestured to the barista. "Can we buy you a coffee? I'd really like to tell you about how a little girl's honest question saved my life, and maybe we can be your first Portland friends." An hour later, the woman, whose name was Becca, had exchanged numbers with Nessa and had plans to meet them next Saturday. And Emma was beaming with pride as they walked back to Hector, who'd been watching the whole thing from their table. "I did it again, Dad. I found another lonely person and helped them," Emma announced, and Hector scooped her up. "You sure did, Bug. I'm proud of you." Nessa leaned against Hector's shoulder and watched Emma chatter about all the things she wanted to show Becca next week. And she felt this overwhelming gratitude for the kid who'd been brave enough to ask a stranger an honest question. Sometimes loneliness isn't about being alone. It's about being alone and having nobody ask if you're okay. And real connection starts when someone sees you and chooses to stay. Nessa had learned that you can't heal isolation by hiding from it. You heal it by being honest about it, by letting someone in when they ask if you need help, by admitting that yes, you do need a friend and you're tired of pretending you don't. If this story reminded you that we're all just people trying to connect, and sometimes all it takes is one honest question to change someone's entire world, hit that subscribe button and share this with someone who might be sitting alone right now, wishing someone would notice. Drop a comment about where you're watching from and tell us about a time someone asked you if you were okay and actually meant it. We love hearing your stories. Thanks for being here with us. And remember, the next time you see someone sitting alone looking like they're trying to disappear, maybe take a chance and ask them if they need a friend. You might just change everything for both of you.